Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. Today, I am really delighted to be joined by Caro Brookings. Caro is known as the Suicide Bereavement Coach. So welcome to the Conscious Grief series.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm so looking forward to speaking to you, Caro. We've kind of been connected for a little while now, but this is the first time we get to sit together and share more about your story and the very powerful work that you do. So first of all, perhaps you could share with the listeners about your own experience of your mother's suicide and what led you to doing this particular work.
Yeah, of course. So, hello everyone. I'm Caro, and I lost my mum to suicide 9 years ago in November of 2013, and it was a great shock for us. None of us weren't expecting it. I was in my last year of uni. It was a great struggle. And as you probably know, if you've dealt with grief, there's a lot of admin stuff to do at the beginning, organizing funerals and all of that. And I remember just trying to get through each day. But especially with suicide loss, you have a lot of complex grief. You've got a lot of guilt. I was dealing with some anger, sadness, supporting other family members. There was a lot going on. And specifically, I want to share just a couple of things that I was dealing with at the time, which are really still vivid in my mind in case other people can relate to it. So the first thing I remember is that every night I went to bed, I was really desperate to dream about my mom because I figured that it was the only way I could still be with her. So every night I hoped and prayed I would dream of her. And I did very occasionally, but nowhere near enough. And the other thing is, and looking back now, I think it's just a way of me trying to process everything that was going on. So I used to play what I call this game in my head where I thought, okay, if I can go back in time only once, what will I do? How will I save my mom? Because I obviously find out, how and when she took her life. So I thought, okay, if I can just be there, right place, right time, I could probably stop her. And then I was like, okay, hang on a minute, but she could do it another time, right? She came to see me for a holiday 2 weeks, 2 months before she took her life. So all of my family are in Germany. I was studying in the UK at the time. And so we spent all that time together. And I thought, oh, I should have picked up on those, which now seem these obvious signs, which they weren't at the time because it wasn't on my mind. But again, who knows, right? But this was really, it was occupying my mind. And to some people, it might sound a bit ridiculous, but to me, it was real because I really believe, what if someone did come, right? What if time travel was possible? I need to be prepared. So saying that it was on my mind all the time, I find it really difficult to focus on anything else. And then, of course, all the should haves and could haves and the guilt and everything. So that went on for quite some time. I tried different healing strategies and nothing worked. And then I got pregnant and we had our first daughter in 2018. And I thought, okay, now it's not just me anymore. I was really desperate in a way to break that generational curse because my mum wasn't diagnosed with any mental health issues as far as I'm aware, but her mum was dealing with depression and she was treated for depression a number of times. So I thought, okay, what does that mean for me now? What does that mean for my daughter? So, when the babies are tiny, they're just hungry all the time. So I was just sitting on the sofa a lot, feeding her. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take this time. I'm going to do more research. I'm going to find something. So again, I was looking, and nothing really resonated with me. It always felt like it was something, that something that worked for one person. And then they say, oh, it's going to work for you. But it didn't. I had tried counseling while I was still at uni, and I felt I was just talking the whole time, but there was no progress. And then I finally found a way of challenging my untrue and unhelpful thoughts, especially around my guilt, and rewire my brain. And that was so powerful for me. And I had great confidence in it the first time I even saw it, because it's all brain-based and science-backed. So we've got brain scans that show how it works and how to rewire the brain. And it made a huge difference for me. I was able to be present for my loved ones, and I was able to let go of their guilt. And I was finally able to find some peace and even joy again, whereas before I had what felt like this ceiling of joy. So, and knowing that, you know, there's still nowhere near enough support out there for suicide loss survivors, and the profound impact it had on my life, I said, I really want to help other people. So having the experience of having lost my mom to suicide, I decided to complete the neurocoaching certification so I could have all the knowledge to then support others, which is what I'm doing now. And then it sort of, you know, started to happen over time. At first, I had my own reservations. Okay, you know, can I actually do this? But again, having the tools to rewire the brain and challenge the thoughts were really powerful. And now, as you know, I run regular interview series, support series, masterclasses. I've got a free private Facebook group for support, and I work with my one-on-one clients as well. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And it's yeah, it sounds really fascinating. This neuro, how do you say it, plasticity?
Yeah, neuroplasticity of how the brain adapts and changes depending on the environment we're in and the stimuli it's getting. Yeah, it is fascinating, and it shows us that the brain is always adapting, the brain is always changing, because actually to think conscious thoughts takes up so much of our energy. So what the brain does is, if we have thoughts coming up time and time again, especially if they're coupled with emotions, the brain is saying, right, I get it, you really believe those thoughts because you keep thinking them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to automate them, because when you've got thoughts automated, you don't need to spend any energy thinking them. You're just basically running on autopilot. And believe it or not, 80 to 90% of all of our thoughts are just running on autopilot. So we go about this life thinking we consciously make all of these decisions, when that's actually not the case.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about, you know, some of the thoughts. You know, maybe you either want to talk about your own experience or perhaps a client case study. You know, so think about if you share, like, what are the thoughts that are running, and then what are you replacing the thoughts, or how does it work?
Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna use an example that I hear quite a lot from clients or people in my group. So one example would be I'm a bad parent, right? If you've lost your child to suicide, you might say, I'm a bad mother, I'm a bad father, I must be for this to happen. So the first thing we really want to do, because it's really individual for each person, is to start paying attention to your thoughts. You know, come off the autopilot and see, okay, what thoughts are coming up. And then it's important to write them down with pen and paper. So with any exercises you do, you always want to use pen and paper, because it forces you to slow down, and it also activates different areas of the brain. So you're actually able to pull things up from your subconscious, which is, you know, when you're just talking or typing, it doesn't have the same effect. So I would say, if anyone's, you know, got any thoughts, to write them down. And then also to keep a tally to see, okay, these thoughts come up a lot, I might start working on this thought first. So if we take the example of I'm a bad mother, what you want to do is refute those thoughts. So there's two ways of doing that. The first is what we call the logical refute. And this is really where we come up with logical reasons of why this isn't true. So, for example, you might, depending on the situation, you might have, you know, phoned your child every day, or, you know, if they were having mental health issues, perhaps you were driving them to all of their appointments. You know, lots of things that you might have done, which shows that actually you did everything you could. So you want to write down all of those statements. So really challenging, like playing the lawyer, right? Making a case for why this isn't true. And then the other part of it is called the mirror refute. This is really, I love how it works and the thoughts behind it. Because when you think about how you talk to yourself day in, day out, and all of the horrible things you say to yourself, those things you wouldn't say to, you know, your best friend, and yet we're totally fine just saying them to ourselves. And it was quite interesting. I had a client the other week, and she had some negative thoughts, and she said, oh, I wouldn't actually say these thoughts about someone she didn't even like, right? But she would quite happily all day go on saying them about herself. So what you want to do to complete this exercise is take the thought, you know, for example, I'm a bad mother. So if you're still on good terms with your husband, you know, your child's father, then that would be a great example. Then you could project it onto him. So you would say out loud, but not to that person. I always make that distinction. Don't go up and say to them, oh, you know, you're a bad father. That's not the point. But you want to say, you know, whatever name you use them, oh, so and so is a bad father. If you can even bring yourself to say that, because sometimes when I do this work with my clients looks at me and say, well, but he's not, I'm not going to say that about him. So I'm like, why not you say it about yourself, right? Where's the difference? So say it out loud. And then what happens is, because you know you love that person, you get really defensive and you think, you know, well, that's not true. They're not a bad parent because they do, you know, all of these things. And the beauty of this is that most of the things you come up with, unless they're really specific to that person, are also true for you. It's just that our brain just focuses on the things that we think we do badly or we think we do wrong, rather the things then that we do well. So what you can do is, you've written all of these thoughts down about your husband, for example, and you can look through of them, and if they're true, if you find they're true for you as well. So for example, you know, you always went to watch Charles' football games or something, and you all went, you know, that's something you did as well. So you want to make sure that all of these statements are then written about you. So if you've written them about your husband, you find them relevant, say, you know, I watched all of my child's football games, for example. So what they end up with is a whole list of things that refute that untrue, unhelpful thought of I'm a bad mother. And then the last step is to rewire the brain. And the way that works is that we want to get a voice recorder on our phone and just read out each of those statements. We don't need to say the I'm a bad mother bit, just all of the statements that we've come up with. And then we want to listen to it first thing in the morning. Ideally, when you first got up, you can make yourself a cup of coffee if you want, and then listen to that, because that sets you up really well for the day, to have those positive thoughts coming in, because you have these negative thoughts all the time. So we're not taking action to start replacing them with those positive thoughts. And then you also want to listen to it last thing at night, because our subconscious is always active. Even when we're asleep, our conscious shuts off. Our subconscious is always active. And that's where, you know, it works usually through our last thoughts of the day. So if you can listen to it just before you fall asleep, that again gives your subconscious those more positive thoughts to work on. And from a biological, scientific standpoint, what happens is these old neural pathways get broken down with those old or your current thoughts, and then the new ones for the new thoughts are being built.
Amazing. And where did the course originate from, the science?
So they did a lot of research from brain scans. So there's a lot out there about neuroplasticity and neuroscience. The neurophysicists did a lot of research about that, and they just noticed how, like we talked about the neuroplasticity, how the brain always adapts and always changes. So if your environment changes, if the stimuli changes, it all comes back to, like we said earlier, preserving energy. So because the brain always wants to work as efficiently as possible. So if it notices that things in the environment changes, the brain will change. So it always runs in the most efficient way.
Yeah, and so it could be used for many things.
Yeah, it works in all areas of life. So yeah, I support suicide loss survivors specifically because, like I said, there's not enough support out there still to this day, but really there's neuro coaches, as we're called, in like finance and business and health, because it all boils down to those untrue and unhelpful thoughts. And the other interesting thing is that the thought always comes first. So again, we've seen scans that show that the thought center of the brain fires microseconds before the emotional center of the brain. So whenever you feel a certain emotions, whether it's sadness, anxiety, joy, whatever it is, there's always a thought that came first, whether you're initially able to catch that thought or not, it's there. So really, it doesn't matter which area in your life, if you can become good, and it takes some practice, but if you can start catching those thoughts, you can do that process, whichever thoughts really. And even though I say I support suicide loss survivors and all my clients are suicide loss survivors, once we especially start working on a one-on-one basis, they usually say, oh, Caro, there's this and this part of my life that isn't going so great, and I want to change that in that part of my life. So it's a really holistic approach. We sort of work on whatever comes up, which again is why I'm such a big fan of it.
Yeah, because it sounds so powerful. Going back to your own personal experience a little bit more. So you took the course and then you really noticed profound shifts in terms of your own grief, which must have been such a relief.
Yeah, definitely. Because I still remember before I did all of this work and I noticed those changes, I still remember vividly one night sitting on the sofa, and I really felt defined and consumed by my thoughts. So I was having all of these thoughts going around in my mind. Most of them were negative. But at that time, I sort of felt, I'm my thoughts are me. I've got all of these thoughts in my mind. I feel defined by my thoughts, but I didn't feel like I had any control or any power over them. It was really scary at one stage. So then when I learned about the whole process of rewiring the brain, I thought, okay, I can actually choose the thoughts I want to think. I can, say, okay, I don't give this thought any power anymore. I'm not going to identify with it. And these are the thoughts that, actually align with where I want to get to. And it's not something that happens overnight. It's not like we say, okay, go and think a different thought. Because if you think about it, some of the thoughts we've had even before our loss. So they might even, go back decades. So it's important to be consistent. And on average, we say it takes about 67 days for the whole rewiring to be done. But people usually notice changes, as they go through after by the 3-week mark. But yeah, that I still remember how powerful and how empowering that was for me to realize, okay, those thoughts that are in my head, they don't have to be that. I can make changes. I can change it.
Yeah, so empowering. So when you work with your clients, do you work, because I know you have the Facebook group, which must be helpful for people to share how they're getting along. Do you mainly work one-to-one or groups as well?
Yeah, so I've got the private Facebook group, which is free. Anyone can join. I just have to answer some membership questions just to make sure they're the right fit. But we've got a really supportive community there. And to me, it's more about just sharing our experiences, because there's groups out there and I think they've all got their place, but some of them I feel that people are just sharing their troubles and their woes, but they're not actually doing anything with it. They're just sitting in it. They're not processing anything. And especially when someone new comes in who's just recently been bereaved, and they see someone 5 years down the line still struggling like on day one, they think, oh no, the same must be true for me. I'm gonna be just like that person, when really it, we don't know if that person ever processed their grief, what other things they might be dealing with, life experiences, all of that. So I created that group so we can actually do things to process our grief, to move forward, to find peace. So most days I provide a little prompt, maybe a journaling prompt or something to share, tell me about something about your loved one, or, things like what you're doing for self-care, or specific, nuggets and steps from the neuroplasticity and the neurocoaching process. So I really love my little group. And then, in terms of working with clients, at the moment, I just work on a one-on-one basis. But I've also got plans for 2023 to offer my first group coaching program. So it's sort of still, I'm still figuring out what that's going to look like, but there will be something like that later in the year. And if people sign up to the mailing list or they join the Facebook group, then they'll be updated with that.
Amazing. And suicide bereavement, obviously, it is one that you specifically, deal with. And I think that there is something so valuable about creating a space which solely, deals with that bereavement. What would you say? What would you say to somebody who's listening to this at the moment, who has recently suffered from a suicide bereavement, that they might, be really desperate to be hearing something supportive right now?
The first thing is really give yourself lots of grace, because it's such a challenging situation, whether you know that your loved one was struggling or not, and really know that you did the best you could with what you knew at the time. Because what tends to happen is, once we find out that our loved one tragically took their life, we then, and I've done it myself, right? I know we look back on all of the fragments of conversations and try and find signs, or we think, oh, we should have done this differently, or should have done that differently. And really, like I said, we did the best we could with what we knew at the time. And now we look back at the situation in hindsight. We look at it through a different lens, knowing what has happened. And I always say it's this catch-22, really. Now we know what has happened. It's too late for us to do anything about it. And when we still had the chance, we didn't know. And to give ourselves lots of grace, and to know that our brains, they tend to focus on the negatives, right? And our brain always likes to be in control. And when we lose our loved one to suicide, that control gets ripped away from us. But the thing is, control is really just an illusion. There's very little we've actually got control over. But from a brain perspective, our brain would rather cling onto the illusion of control and grapple onto all of the things that we feel like we could have done or should have done, whether it's even feasible or not, rather than saying, oh, actually I was helpless in that situation, helpless to do anything about it. Because helplessness to our brain is scary. So even though it's not nice to be in a place of guilt and blaming ourselves, our brain would rather do that than saying, oh, I was helpless. And there's a few little exercises people can do if they don't want to dive into the rewiring straight away, or they feel, I know at the beginning we've only got limited capacity to do anything at any one time, but there's a couple of 3 nice exercises that they can give a go. So the first one is, when we think about all of the should haves and could haves, to actually write them all down. Again, everything with pen and paper, and look at each of them in turn, really, again, challenge them and think, okay, is this true? Think, okay, if I had done what I say I should have done or could have done, can I be absolutely sure that my loved one would still be here? Which often, most of the time, the answer is no. Like with my mum, right? If I had done one thing, she might have still taken her life another day. And I was actually talking to one of my clients today, and she was blaming herself. We talked about the blame because she suggested that her son go back onto antidepressants, and I know there's a lot in the press at the moment about antidepressants and their effects and side effects. So she was feeling, guilty about that. But like we said, we don't know if that was the cause of it, and also, if that specific example, of course, that her son was seeing a doctor who prescribed them. So there was, again, actually limited control that she actually had. But I said to her, what do you think would have happened if you hadn't suggested he go back onto the antidepressants and he had still taken his life? Would we still be sat here and you would be saying, oh, I wish I had told him to go into the antidepressants? So that's a really powerful way of turning it round. When you think, okay, I should have done, or I did this and I shouldn't have. Okay, well, if you hadn't done it and we had the same outcome, would you then still sit here and blame yourself for that? So that's one thing. Another thing, like we said earlier, the brain always focuses on the negative. So one thing you can do is actively think about some of the positives. So another really nice exercise is to write down everything you did to support your loved one, and not just in the weeks and months running up to the suicide, but throughout, their lifetime or however long you knew them. And it's such a powerful exercise, because normally people are like, oh, I can't come up with anything, because remember, your brain's just negative, you did all of these things wrong. But when you actually take the time to sit down and start writing, one of my clients came up with 46 things. And I think that's just so beautiful to have that reminder. And when we feel particularly down, particularly guilty, we can read through it, or if it happens, I'd even make another recording and listen to that as well. And then the last thing is, when we talked about really not having control about things, a really good exercise to illustrate that is to write down all of the outside, what I call outside influences, so things that influenced your loved one's life and maybe even their suicide, which you had no control over. And even, as parents, we feel, oh, we should have protected our child, right? As spouses, we think, oh, we should have been there for them and supported them, or the list goes on. But really, again, when you look at it a bit closer, there's so many factors which shaped their life, which we had no control over. So if you're at the start of your loss journey, there's some things for you to think about, some exercise to get you started. And then, by all means, join the group. We're really supportive, and get in touch, and we can see how we can help you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Caro. It was just making me think, slightly on a different subject, but the way that the brain is often wired to go to the negative more than the positive. Is that true in most circumstances?
Yeah. Again, it's really, that's the thing, right, with the brain and all of this. It's valid for everyone in all circumstances, and it goes back to however many thousands of years when we were hunter-gatherers, and our brain always had to look out for the next danger. And by always looking on the negative, by always expecting the worst, we were actually sort of protecting ourselves from the bear who's hiding behind the bush and coming to get us or something, right? So it's really in all aspects of life, we just tend to focus on the positives. And again, we might not even realize that all of these automations that are running our lives, we might just be, running, they might just be running in the background. And until we, become conscious of what's going on, like you talk about the conscious grief, we don't even realize it. So it's so important that we start paying attention to our thoughts and catch those negative thoughts so we can start refuting them.
And that really applies to whether it's a suicide bereavement or not. But, when we've experienced trauma and death, it's really common for us to go to the worst case scenario in all cases. And I have to really watch that myself. If my dog is remotely showing signs that he's not, himself, my brain will immediately be like, he's gonna die. That's it. And so it's amazing how easily we just go down that route instead of being rational.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when, again, it takes practice, but to sort of catch ourselves and step in and like put a pause in before our chatty mind just runs away with it and say, okay, hang on a minute, I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to, see, is this actually true? Is it realistic? All of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it works everywhere.
Yeah, and I guess it's sort of what happens in meditation maybe as well, with the studies that you've probably looked at, how brains change through that practice.
Yeah, exactly. All kinds of mindfulness techniques like that, meditation, even taking a breather can be really helpful. It's all about putting a stop in these automations. And while I'm thinking about it, even when, say, we're having an argument with someone about something, the conscious part of our brain actually completely shuts off, and that's why we often say things that we don't mean. So again, it takes practice, but if we're able to put that stop in and think, okay, what am I actually doing? Where is this going? And also know that the other person, their conscious part of the brain is shut off. And for us to not take everything on as face value can be really powerful. And, especially also for suicide loss survivors, there's a lot of judgment there, and there's a lot of stigma there with suicide loss. So that's another, really powerful tool. And again, it takes practice. It all takes practice. But it's just so worth it when, people stop getting in touch, right? We really notice with loss in general, and especially suicide loss, our address book shrinks. But I always say quality over quantity. I'd rather you have 2, 3, 4 people who you can go to, and they're really, they say kind, patient, and non-judgmental, rather than having 20 or 100 people and you have to pretend you're all right when you're not. And then to realize that when people say something to you, when they make a hurtful comment, to think, okay, that's them, it reflects on them, it reflects their experiences, their beliefs. It doesn't mean anything about me or my loved one. Again, that can be really powerful to learn not to take on. When they say, oh, if the cap fits, wear it. Well, say, okay, no, thank you, I choose not to take that on.
Yeah, well, that's a very definitely a conscious way of being and looking at it. So which comes to my question, in your interpretation, what would you say conscious grief looks like or is?
Yeah, so it goes back to, like you said, automations running most of our lives, and running our grief, how we deal with our grief or not, if we choose to process our grief, or if we subconsciously decide, okay, I'm just gonna stuff it away and not think about it again and think it's gonna go away when it's not. So for me, conscious grief is actually making the conscious decision to be aware of our thoughts and to not let them run our lives, but actually say, okay, I choose this thought, you know, is aligned with where I want to get to, with how I want to process my grief, or say, okay, that thought, you know, thank you, but no thank you, I'm going to replace that with something that actually serves me.
I love that. Yeah, that's definitely a new interpretation, which I really love. Thank you, Caro.
Yeah.
And I know that you have got like a really wonderful free gift. So would you like to explain that to the listeners?
Yeah, definitely. So my free gift is a free PDF guide that they'll be able to download, and there's space to, you know, fill in your own thoughts, and you need to print it off to fill it in, pen and paper.
Yeah.
But it's sort of divided into 3 parts. So the first part really looks at the complex grief that we're dealing with as a suicide loss survivor, because it's much more about guilt. Like we said, there's anger, there's the sadness, isolation, all of these things. So I've linked up a few videos and Facebook lives that I've done in the past, where on the computer or phone they can click on and watch that. And there's also one I've actually done, which is supposed to be for people who support suicide loss survivors. So if there's people around you where you think, oh yeah, they don't know how to support me, I don't really have the energy to tell them, send them that video, and I go through some of the top tips on how to best support suicide loss survivors. The second part is all about self-care, because like they say, you can't pour from an empty cup. And, you know, everyone in this world should practice self-care, but especially when we've suffered from a loss, and especially a suicide loss. So there's some ideas, some suggestions on what to do, and also some tips on how to put that into your schedule, so you don't just do it once in a while, but with everything, consistency is key. And then last but not least, I've sort of broken down the whole refuting process that I talked about earlier. So you have the prompts, you can read them, and there's space for you to write down your thoughts and write down the refutes. And there's even, if you remember, I talked about this 67 days it takes on average to rewire the brain. So there's like a box you can tick each day that you've listened to your recording.
Wow, that's so generous, Caro. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, so don't forget to click on the link below to receive that. Is there anything else that you'd like to add just before we close out?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for putting this together and for having me. It's really been a pleasure to talk, and I'm hoping that your viewers find some of that helpful. And, you know, like I said earlier, if you find, okay, you know, I've grief brain, I can, you know, barely focus on one thing at a time, you know, just take baby steps and just start by observing your thoughts and not believing everything you're saying, and start being kind and gentle with yourself, and go from there.
Oh, yes, I love that. Yeah, baby steps and kind and gentle. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Caro, and thank you very much to everyone who's been listening.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Bye.